Hello and welcome to the first of this 3-webinar series on human rights impact assessments. People are just joining the call now, I can see, so I'll give them a few seconds to log in. My name is Amelia Knott and I'm the Director of Consulting at UK-based firm 2050. And along with Kendall Salcito, the Executive Director of Nomagaya, I'm your co-host of this webinar today. So we'll just give it a few more minutes before we start properly. I can see a number of people still signing in. Okay. Right, I think we'll start there. So today we're going to be presenting 3 case studies in human rights impact assessments from various sectors. I'll be tackling the extractive sector and talking about a case study from an oil project in East Africa. Kendall will then present a human rights assessment from a palm oil plantation in Liberia. And Salah Hosseini from BSR in New York will present a 3rd human rights impact assessment from the beverage industry working in multiple markets. So just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentations, then please type them in the question box in your control panel on the right of your screen. I will then pull them up at the end of each of the presentations for discussion, and we'll also have time for further questions at the end. The idea is that we will talk for 10 to 15 minutes each on each of these case studies, so there should be sufficient time for a good discussion. Now, I'd like to start with a quick poll. So, this is one for all of you to be involved in. I would like to ask you, to what extent have you been involved in a human rights impact assessment? So please tick if you or your company have commissioned one, if you've been involved in conducting one, perhaps as a practitioner, and if you're planning to commission or conduct one, and if you haven't been involved in one yet. Okay, so I can see that you've almost all voted. I can encourage the last of you to vote. That would be very helpful. Okay, numbers going up. That's fantastic. Right, I'm going to close that and let's look at the results. So that's interesting. A 3rd of you haven't been involved at all in a human rights impact assessment yet. A 3rd have been involved in conducting one, and the remainder have either commissioned one or are planning to commission or be involved in one. Very interesting. Any comments from Kendall or Salah here?
Hi everybody, this is Kendall Salcito from Nomagaya. I can't actually see the poll or the poll results, but I'm delighted to have such a breadth of attendees at this webinar. It's great to have experienced folks with experienced questions and some individuals who are pretty new to this scene.
And this is Salah Hosseini. I'm delighted to see how many people have been involved in conducting an HRA. Just indicates how quickly this field is growing, so that's very positive.
Fantastic. I'm going to ask you one more question before we launch in. So, for those of you who have commissioned an HRA or been involved in one, or even if you haven't, thinking about it, what would you say is the hardest thing about doing a human rights impact assessment? Please select one of the below. So getting buy-in from other departments within the company, scoping the assessment, making sure that it meets the needs of both the business and the human rights requirements, getting the budget to implement change, finding practitioners to carry out or support your assessment, or getting honest input from respondents. And that could be suppliers, it could be community members, it could be people within the company. So if I could encourage you all to vote, this is the last of the polls. I can see the numbers ticking up. I'm going to give you a few more seconds. And okay, I'm going to close the poll there. And we'll look at the results. So 31% getting buy-in from other departments within the company, 31% scoping the assessment, 13% getting the budget to implement change, only 5% find finding the practitioners a challenge, and 21% on getting honest input from respondents. So that's, again, very interesting results. I'm particularly interested that the budget to implement change isn't seen as one of the hardest. Certainly, that's been a perspective that we've found has often been the resources. So that's really interesting to hear, actually, that there are that may be one hurdle that people are starting to get over. Okay, I'm going to move on then to the first of the case studies. For those of you who don't know 2050, we're a management consultancy that specialises in helping companies to understand and address their social risks and impacts. And we've been around since 2004, and we've worked on human rights impact assessments in a number of sectors, including tourism, pharmaceuticals, telecoms, and extractives. So moving on to this particular case study. I'll just give you a brief background. So we were working for an oil and gas company carrying out exploration in East Africa. The project involved a 2-week field assessment, and we used a team that combined international expertise with local consultants. And we had, within that, it was quite a small team. One of those consultants was from the area where the oil exploration was taking place. Another one was from the same country, but from a different area. So they brought different perspectives. What we aimed to do was to provide an independent view of the actual and potential human rights impacts of company activities, whether those activities met the expectations that had been established in the company's own human rights policy, which was underpinned by international standards, and whether the processes that were required to manage those human rights impacts on an ongoing basis were in place, both at the operational level on the ground and at group level. And the assessment involved 3 different levels. So we looked for red flags, which was a specific review of the measures in place to avoid potential for legal liability through complicity in international crimes. We looked at respect for human rights, identifying and mitigating actual or potential adverse human rights impacts in line with the UN guiding principles and also the IFC performance standards. And then we also looked at what they were doing in terms of support for human rights. So their existing activities, but also opportunities to support the realisation of human rights. And each of these we looked at in terms of potentially affected groups, whether the company was causing, contributing or linked to the impacts, and we looked at the risk to business as well. And just to give you an example, the heat map, which apologies is a bit blurry, what this is showing is potential impacts in black and actual impacts in white against an assessment of their severity and likelihood. So we identified, I think it was 21 in total, actual potential impacts. So moving on to the next slide. So many of the actual and potential human rights impacts we identified were very specific to the context and the history of the company's involvement in the area. However, what I wanted to do was to highlight for you 4 key findings that I thought would have relevance to other sectors and to companies working in other geographies. I'm just going to ask my fellow panelists to use their mute buttons because we're getting a little bit of feedback. Thank you. Okay, so firstly, the impacts that we identified, we found often didn't fit neatly into categories or boxes, but sort of overlapped, I think showing the complexity of both understanding the issues and the challenges of addressing them. So, for example, the company had experienced protests by local communities, which it had put into the security category originally. However, the causes of the protests were often related to mismanaged expectations of jobs. And now the nature of oil exploration is people are often given temporary jobs and then they're laid off as the company moves on. And there are also a lot of contractual requirements around local content. So a percentage of jobs must be reserved for local people. And we found that there was a number of different ways that the overlap between security and employment manifested as a result. So just to give you an example, there were youths that fought each other for jobs. The layoffs that I mentioned led to roadblocks and protests. And also, different practices by different contractors then increased and added to tensions. We also found the definition of local in local content caused some challenges. So if people were brought in from other parts of the same country or even from the wrong village, that could be an issue in terms of local challenges. So our second key finding I wanted to mention was about the nature of stakeholder engagement and communications. Now, the company had a really solid process in place for identifying the right stakeholders when they needed access to a particular location, and then going through the process to ask their permission to proceed. However, we found that the local people were much more relational in their approach to communications rather than transactional. So they really enjoyed interaction, and they wanted to build what they described to us as a genuine friendship with the company. However, what they felt was that the company only talked to them when they wanted something. Now, on paper, the company had done all the right things. It had scaled up its field presence, it put in place a communications team, and it was introducing new approaches to increase communication with the local population and stakeholders. But it was still showing quite a reticence around what it then communicated. And where you had a communications vacuum, they found it was often likely to be filled with inaccurate information and sometimes deliberately deceptive information by some of the local elites who were also contributing to the tensions within the workforce and among local populations. I think this difference between relational and transactional approaches is a really interesting one in terms of understanding how best to engage, particularly with host communities. Our third finding was that a significant amount of company resources were being used to manage legacy issues from their earlier operations in the area, when they'd gone in without processes in place to understand and manage the context they were operating in. So this included fulfilling rash promises made to local governments and populations, and also remediating adverse human rights impacts the company had been previously responsible for. So by the time we arrived, the company was actually already aware of its most severe impacts, and it had or was in the process of putting in place mitigating actions to manage and address them. The initial missteps, however, had generated significant and expensive issues through which the company was working. And what this really highlights is the importance of carrying out human rights assessments much earlier stage of company operations, and also providing adequate training for staff right from the start of their activities in a country, and then resourcing the teams properly to manage potential human rights impacts. Now, for any oil project, in fact, for any sorts of company projects, there are going to be challenges around expectations. But I think that by embedding an understanding of human rights at each stage of the company's own internal approval processes, that would better enable teams to plan for possible issues that could arise and avoid those initial missteps. And this is likely to involve more resource up front, but it does have the potential to save significant costs as projects develop. And the final finding I wanted to mention related to the livelihoods of local communities, and I think demonstrates the insight that a human rights impact assessment can bring, which is really different to something like an environmental and social impact assessment. So by understanding the company activities from the perspective of those affected, we were able to identify how a range of what seemed to be relatively minor impacts were cumulatively making significant changes to local livelihoods. And the local culture in that part of the world was very much intertwined with the livelihoods as well. So the loss of one was severely impacting and likely to lead to the loss of the other. Now, there are many people who would argue, and many people did argue, that these traditional livelihoods were already dying out as a result of demographic shifts and young people seeking alternative opportunities. But we were also able to demonstrate that the company's arrival was accelerating those changes. So, for example, the company was providing many of these alternative opportunities for youth, albeit temporary and limited ones. And these were leading to, contributing to disruption of traditional family structures. They were attracting incomers to previously quite closed communities, and they were monetizing the local economy in some cases for the first time. It was also encouraging much larger settlements as well. And cumulatively, these amounted to a major impact on those traditional local livelihoods. And although the immediate business risk may not be significant, there is a much longer term question of legacy which exists as a result. So I'm going to move on to, this is my final slide, around some of the recommendations and lessons learned. And again, I've pulled out those recommendations I thought would be of most relevance to those of you on the call today. Now, firstly, the overlapping nature of the impacts and the legacy issues that we identified, I think, showed the importance of cross-functional collaboration in developing responses. So actions taken in one part of the business were having significant knock-on effects on other parts of the operations. Employment practices, the physical operations, the logistics and the movement of equipment, the purchasing decisions, the practices of contractors, and other overall strategies. All of those needed to play a role in finding ways to address the past issues, the current ones, and the potential future ones as well. And linked to this is ensuring that information and approaches are clearly shared with contractors. So external stakeholders really struggle to distinguish between the actions of a company and its contractors, particularly on a project like this. So it was really essential to ensure that the contractors could support good human rights practices and that their actions don't end up undermining good work that the company is carrying out, whether they do that accidentally or otherwise. So our recommendations included establishing a forum for regular exchanges with contractors, so you could have a common framework for things like manpower resourcing that would help to identify and quickly resolve some of those employment issues that kept coming up. Now, to address the challenges around stakeholder engagement, we recommended building deeper relationships with communities that focused on really regular engagement and not simply one-way communications. So this included taking time to develop ties with communities, working through their traditional governance structures and engaging them as allies in maintaining security. Now, the wider lesson here is about the importance of taking the time to understand the context better and to be both transparent and accessible to avoid misunderstandings and to better manage expectations and to form genuine partnerships with host communities. I recognise that companies are not traditionally set up for a relational approach because it does involve commitment by individuals to forming authentic friendships. But I have seen it done successfully elsewhere. And I think that perhaps exploring new models of doing business may be one of the ways forward for companies that are operating in these sorts of challenging environments. Now, the fourth recommendation I wanted to mention was about the importance of building human rights impact management into the operational costs of doing business right from the start. This is a learning the company that we work with could take forward into the next phase of its work as well. So it was currently in exploration phase, it was thinking about moving into development. And if we recommended that they start really early to build the capacity of local institutions, local civil society organisations to manage the anticipated impacts of the next phase of development. And the type of impacts I'm referring to are things like a fresh influx of people to work on the projects that could perhaps then lead to pressure on sanitation or water, more road traffic, potentially increases in things like sexually transmitted infections, and also making sure that there was going to be sufficient things like worker accommodation. And related to that is the need to work with other stakeholders, including government and civil society, to address these impacts. And that would be a really strategic approach that enabled everyone to share lessons, avoid duplication, and avoid accidentally working against each other. And incidentally, that sort of approach would also align very much with the aspirations of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. Now, finally, on the issue of cumulative impacts on local livelihoods that I mentioned, we recommended to the company that they sought to address these through their existing social investment strategy, which had previously been relatively ad hoc. And that could be a truly impactful way to use the sorts of budgets that are often set aside by companies for more philanthropic projects. It would be a way of addressing something, addressing the broader impact that will have ultimately managing some of those longer-term business risks. And to be really effective at that, we recommended working with specialist NGOs on the issue. So those are the sort of broad recommendations and lessons learned. There were a couple of practicalities that I wanted to mention as well. Carrying out something as complex as a human rights impact assessment properly really involves engagement with a wide range of different stakeholders and rights holders. And this sort of engagement may need to be very sensitively done, and it may require a period of relationship building first. So to do this effectively, human rights impact assessments really need time and resources from the company, and then a commitment to invest in implementing the recommendations and taking into account findings, and also following up with those people that had been interviewed. And you know, we were lucky that this client was prepared to invest in the human rights impact assessment, although there were some issues with the timescale, which I think is probably a common one. And the deadline for the field visit ended up being fixed, which put quite a lot of pressure on us. So that's a quick run through of the of this particular case study. I'd like to see if there are any questions. And I can see that we've got one that's come in, which I'm going to send over to Kendall to have a look at.
So the question that's come in is, in your experience, how seriously do companies take these HRIAs? Despite them being done, few companies take steps to address their human rights impacts.
That's a great question. I think companies do take these seriously. I think there are a lot of challenges that then happen in terms of implementing the recommendations. So, for example, in the oil industry, I don't know if you noted, but the case study, this particular work that we did was in 2014. In early 2015, the oil price dropped dramatically, and it became increasingly hard for our client, but also for all sorts of companies, to maintain a focus on these sorts of issues. And I think that has slowed down some of their ability to take these steps. I think it's a lot of the recommendations we tried to make as practical as possible. We tried to make them very much, this is the next step that you can do, this is where you might want to end up. I think it's very difficult if the recommendations ask for wholesale reform right at the outset. But it varies is my answer to that. And I don't think we've seen enough human rights impact assessments to really start to draw firm conclusions about this. I don't know, Kendall and Salah, you might want to chip in here with your experiences as well.
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind that companies aren't monoliths. So when you're wondering whether companies take HRIAs seriously, there are some departments within a company that absolutely don't, but there are some departments that can really use an HRIA to leverage a position to make a case for better protective gear, or to make a case for more resource investment into community relations. There are, companies as a whole. I wouldn't want to generalize about companies in general or about the departments within companies themselves, but I've seen HRIAs used at various levels. They just tend to be most useful to companies when there's buy-in from the very top and from the very bottom, in my experience.
And that's been our experience here at BSR as well. The companies that commit budgets to conducting the HRAs typically will invest in remediation as well. So if they're spending money on the process, they'll spend money on the solutions or the fixes as well.
Fantastic. We've got another question that's come in.
All right, another respondent asks, how different would the results have been if the term human rights had been social impacts? Surely good social practitioners would come to the same findings.
Very interesting. We actually did use the term social impacts during this assessment. And in terms of how we at 2050 look at this, we see human rights as all about social risks and social impacts, and we tailor the language depending on who we're talking to. If we're talking to human rights practitioners, then we talk in the language of human rights. If we're not, then we do tend to use social impacts, and we did in this case as well. And I would say that social practitioners and human rights practitioners broadly are working towards the same goals. So yes, I think they should come to the same findings.
I certainly second.
Go ahead, Salah.
I'm sorry, Ken. I certainly second that. And typically, when we do these the impact assessments and conduct interviews on the ground, we tend to avoid the term human rights only because for individuals not familiar with the practice of HRAs, it just causes some confusion. So when you speak in the language of social impacts or health and safety, or more concrete terms, I think it helps people not familiar with the space understand what the purpose of the HRA is. And so terminology can be confusing, and it's best to use terms that your interviewees are most comfortable with.
I think this question reflects a pretty strong understanding of the extractive sector, and I think it's sort of hinging off of the idea that if we're already doing a really good ESIA, why do we need a human rights impact assessment? And what I would say is that from my experience, the social dimensions of a social impact assessment don't actually look at at perspectives from local populations and dig deeply into conditions that are affecting their sense of welfare. Social impact assessment makes a strong effort to be data oriented, and as a result, in practice, they often give you head counts of how many students there are and how many there will be and how many jobs will be created, affecting how many families and how many people will benefit from an additional clinic, but they don't look at conditions as understood by rights holders, by local populations, and it's often those perceptional issues that trigger major concerns down the road, and that's where a huge value add on the human rights perspective comes in. Another question has come in the meantime. Nowadays, environmental impact assessments include a social component. To what extent does the social integrate human rights issues? I'm going to toss that one back to Amelia.
Yeah, well, I think you've already started to answer it. So I would say, a human rights impact assessment specifically seeks to look from the perspective of key affected groups, such as workers and communities, and to understand the business risks that arise from these impacts. But it's able to consider causes of impacts other than the company actions, so things like the behaviour of state security forces. And that's not necessarily the same with an ESIA, which tends to follow quite a structured approach. We've actually had I can see a number of questions that have come in about ESIAs. What I think I'm going to do at this point is suggest that we move on to the next case study, and I will have a look at the questions in the meantime, and we'll be able to answer a few more at the end of Kendall's presentation. So I'm going to hand over to Kendall now to talk through hers.
Thanks, Amelia. I'm, as I said, Kendall Salcido from Nomogea, and I'm going to talk about palm oil. So Amelia's presentation set the groundwork for some of the more well-established human rights impact assessments out there in the extractive sector. And methodologies for HRAs in other sectors are just less frequently publicly piloted, so I'm hoping to build on Amelia's presentation with mine. As I mentioned, the case study here is in palm oil. Palm oil is in 50% of household products, and it's in the supply chains of the world's largest food and consumer product companies. The human rights impacts of palm oil are in my refrigerator, pantry, cleaning closet, and almost certainly in yours too. My presentation provides, I meant to mention over here, Nomogea is not a consulting firm, so we have the opportunity to publish everything that we do online. So this is a hyperlink to the actual assessment that we did on equatorial palm oil. And you'll get these slides, and so you can read that report if you are so inclined. My presentation provides some brief background on the operation and assessment process, and then select findings and recommendations to the company, and then follows up with reflections on some of the nuances of an agricultural human rights assessment that were interesting at EPO. So EPO, Equatorial Palm Oil, is a British-based company that has 2 Liberian operations. The plantation we assessed is called Palm Bay Estate, located just south of the port city of Buchanan. EPO is British, but it was recently purchased by a major Malaysian corporation, KLK, which is one of the largest palm oil companies in the world. And while EPO is a new company, the plantations aren't. In the mid to late 1900s, Palm Bay Estate was owned by a different foreign company called Libinco, which folded during Liberia's civil war. This context was deeply relevant to the human rights risks and impacts associated with EPO's activities. In this post-conflict period, the economy remains in tatters. Job scarcity is ubiquitous. The woman pictured here is processing what's called artisanal palm oil, where people basically head out to old abandoned plantations, cut fruit, and process it by hand to sell in roadside stands. And palm oil is the cheapest oil around on the general market, so the money economy here is pretty tenuous. The standard of living is so low that 43% of residents in the county of Grand Bassa occupy the lowest quintile of wealth. 66% of adults have received no education, and only 4% of pregnant women are attended by a doctor for delivery. Setting the scope for assessment in this context started with decisions about how much of Grand Bassa County was affected by the arrival of roughly 1,000 full-time jobs in a 13,000-hectare operation, and also how a company could be expected to manage the risks driven by such a troubled context. Scoping to particular human rights issues could only be conducted on site. We had hoped to scope from afar, and that wasn't possible. Media reports had focused on land tenure issues as the primary human rights concern, but the things that make headlines aren't always the ones that dominate local concerns or most severely affect human rights. Because the assessment was focused specifically on risks, fieldwork was brief, a scoping visit followed by an assessment visit, totaling about a week on the ground. And the aim there was to make the assessment swift and low cost on two premises, basically. First, that EPO might conduct human rights due diligence of its own after risks have been identified. And second, that agriculture is a sector where it's often large companies, conglomerates, investors that are overseeing operations, and the time and resources they would need for a full-scale HRIA akin to what Amelia described are just unlikely to be available for every operation. So we needed something more slimmed down. There were also questions about whose human rights policies might be applicable. Palm Bay is owned by EPO, but EPO is a subsidiary of KLK, which provides palm oil to Unilever, Procter & Gamble, Cargill, and so many others. And then these companies have standards, and then they have dozens of brands underneath them that have standards of their own. So human rights violations at Palm Bay could potentially violate Ben & Jerry's human rights policy without violating Unilever's. And so rather than scope to policies, we just scoped to best practice, specifically the UN guiding principles. Data gathering, this is a picture of my colleague Mark Wilga here, listening at a community meeting, and our field work was really listening focused, structured primarily to gather perspectives from rights holders that we could then validate in key informant interviews with company personnel and with civil society and government. And in a sort of a departure from our extractive HRIAs, we met with personnel from other palm oil plantations in Liberia with the aim of better understanding the context. We tried to engage with the Environmental Protection Agency, but were repeatedly rebuffed. And that cold shoulder primarily served to demonstrate that the government bodies were not really effectively managing or gathering data on private sector operations. And the company confirmed that for us when we asked. So the red flags, as Amelia termed them, at Palm Bay were driven by context, operations, and policy. This incredibly harsh and impoverished post-conflict context required proactive efforts to respect labor rights, and those efforts weren't being made. Operational decisions in early palm oil years to cut costs before production generated revenues just wasn't rights respectful. You know, the company didn't have cash on hand to be rights respectful before it was making money, and that's just a real challenge in agriculture. There were no extreme impacts, but the most severe scores, which you can see in the black and red boxes, were all labor related. There were certain impacts on just remuneration and collective bargaining, and they were termed certain rather than a level of risk because they were ongoing. We could actually document them. A living wage calculation had found that contractor wages were roughly $2 a day, and that's not sufficient even in a Liberian context to provide for an adequate standard of living. And those wages were also unequal to the wages paid to direct employees for the same work. And then union busting through temporary hiring and contract working were infringing on the right to collective bargaining. The right to safe working conditions was at quite high risk and high likelihood. We found workers using sharp tools and toxic chemicals, including paraquat, without gloves, masks, or goggles. So this is a worker who the fresh fruit bunch in this picture is on the end of a pointy spike. And he had no gear at all, whereas neighboring plantations had boots and gloves and eye protection. The right to a clean environment in the central orange box included the right to health, water, and sanitation, and to adequate housing. And worker housing was sufficient for about half of the workers employed, which meant that 2 families were crammed into single-family dwellings, sometimes in communities without functional water wells. The health facility had been outsourced to the company by the government, but it was in the middle of the plantation and generally inaccessible to residents. There weren't enough latrines on a per-person basis in any community that we visited. And then looking at the yellow rated rights issues, it's worth noting that the predominant concerns over palm oil, traditionally, which pertain to land acquisition and environmental degradation, really couldn't be confirmed at Palm Bay. These merited further investigation and monitoring, but they weren't immediately the most pressing issues. And what was interesting to us was why. First, the property and land issues were being actively managed because there had already been a roundtable on sustainable palm oil RSPO complaint filed about land grabbing. So the company was already really on top of that issue. And then environmental impacts on downstream communities just couldn't be confirmed because the Liberian government required almost no environmental monitoring, and EPO wasn't carrying any out independently. And then you might also see on here freedom from child labor in this sort of central yellow box. And child labor was just difficult to confirm on short notice. And this is for ethical reasons. As outsiders, we had little access to workforce middlemen, and we had very little time on site. So this is really just a gratuitous shot of adorable Liberian children, but we didn't do child engagement because engaging with vulnerable rights holders on such a short timeline couldn't be done ethically. So we flagged it as a risk and let the company know that there was a responsibility to look further into extensive allegations of child labor, but we couldn't explore that in detail. So recommendations-wise, because the impact identification was driven by such concrete indicators, our recommendations were equally concrete. We recommended improved wages, replacement of subcontractors with full-time employment, and the provision of PPEs, and also a tracking of how many had been purchased and when replacement was needed. We recommended water quality monitoring and major housing upgrades. And our overarching recommendation was just that the company commission a full-scale HRIA to know which risks merited further follow-up and which ones weren't really major issues. And to our delight, this last recommendation was actually taken up, and EPO had a human rights consultant in country just last week to start work on human rights due diligence for the company. We're not totally sure why EPO internalized our findings and acted on them, but our assessment included an array of leverage points that might have pressured EPO, and these included EPO's policies and government agreements, KLK's policies, non-financial reporting rules in the UK that might affect EPO, and then, of course, the UN guiding principles. And we imagine that if we were consultants and actually hired to do this assessment, then just the commissioning of the assessment itself might create a compelling case for improving human rights performance. And that is absolutely a positive thing, but it's sort of come to our attention that that could also create a scenario where the parent company or lender or whatever third party requiring a human rights assessment might be setting the scope according to their interests. And as I said before, it was essential that we set the scope for this because the issues that the company thought were the primary human rights issues pertaining to land acquisition weren't borne out in our findings. And there was a totally different human rights focus that was needed on site that couldn't have been predetermined by boardroom executives. So another major take home from this and other short timeline assessments is that risk assessment is not well suited to evaluating major risks to vulnerable groups. As I said, we didn't delve deeply into questions of child labor here, and that was simply because human rights assessment has to, in its process, respect rights. So on other sites, assessors can't look deeply into, for example, sexual violence. And these are obviously hot button human rights issues that need to be investigated, but a short timeline risk assessment just isn't right for that. And then finally, there are myriad reasons why short timeline risk assessments aren't appealing to operations, starting with the fact that they look only at big ticket negative issues. And we had to have an extended dialogue with EPO before management was ready to seriously think about our findings. And as a result, it was of enormous value that our findings were strongly evidenced or presented solely as risks that need to be more closely scrutinized. Because these negative findings are so unappealing, it seems important to us that any interested third party that's calling on an operation to look at its risks should also seriously consider committing to help manage the issues that arise. And EPO is taking remarkable initiative on engaging on its issues and working to address them, but I don't think that can be expected of many operations that are feeding into enormous supply chains. And these supply chains are something that Salah is going to talk about in much greater detail in his presentation. So I will leave some of that to him, but if there are some quick questions on my slides, please don't hesitate to type them into the question box.
Okay, I've got a question for you, Kendall. Were the findings captured using in-person observations only? And if so, how did you ensure that you systematically captured all violations? And how did you distinguish between one-off violations versus ongoing violations using a short observational site visit? So that's one of the questions that's come in.
So the answer to the first half of that question is, I guess it's a three-part question. So assessment was not purely observational, it was also data-oriented. Like in all quality impact assessment, there was an extensive literature review as well, and what we observed, we then validated with company personnel or with local populations. How do we know that we touched on all issues? We don't. It was a risk assessment. It was designed to be short and targeted towards the most substantial issues at the time. And I love this question because, frankly, I don't think risk assessment is good enough to call itself due diligence. And it's very snapshot oriented. So EPO hadn't had any violence on site, but 2 other palm oil companies in Liberia had faced violent riots in the past year. And I had thought that that would become a risk at EPO, but frankly, the jobs weren't good enough to fight over. So I suspect that if EPO increases wages and becomes a desirable employer, there will also be security issues to look at. And those just didn't happen to be present at the time that we were doing the assessment. So no, it doesn't look at all issues. There's absolutely no guarantee of that. That's why one of our recommendations was that EPO follow up with more meaningful human rights due diligence. We basically just flagged that issues were big enough that it was merited. And then the third part of that question was?
So the third part was around how did you distinguish between one-off violations and ongoing violations in a short observational site visit?
We didn't. We distinguished between risks and impacts. Risks being potential impacts that may have occurred once and might not occur again. So looking at property rights, we know that that property rights were violated previously because it was confirmed in an RSPO complaint, but the policies had changed substantially, and so we saw that as a risk that it might occur again, but we couldn't ensure that it was entirely remedied. That was going to need ongoing monitoring.
And I've got another question for you, Kendall. We haven't got a huge amount of time to answer it because I'm keen to move on to Salah as well. But if you could answer quickly, did you examine what sorts of human labour rights protections were afforded by Liberian law, and if the company was in clear violation of the law where they were operating, might that have been an additional leverage point?
Um, Liberian law is a really interesting topic. So, for example, Liberian minimum wage law was written with the support of the ILO in closed-door meetings. So the ILO contributed to discussions of what would be a living wage, and then the Liberian government set it at something else, taking into account what businesses preferred and what contextually was palatable, and then also, potentially looking at the human rights side of things. Um, Liberian law has some labor protections, um, but the Liberian government has also shown astounding flexibility when it comes to implementing those laws. So that wasn't an important point of leverage for us, especially because in cases where law doesn't protect human rights, we don't want to use the laws that do and then ignore the laws that don't. It's a pretty non-legal perspective we take.
Great. Well, thanks very much. I'm going to move on now to Salah's case study, please.
Sure, thank you both very much. So my name is Salah Husseini. I'm a manager on BSR's human rights team based in New York. For those of you not familiar with BSR, we are a mission-driven, not-for-profit organization with a few different varieties of work streams. We are a membership organization and also consult on various sustainability issues, including human rights, supply chains, and environmental issues. So I wanted to review first our human rights impact assessment process and our rationale for conducting human rights impact assessments, and then move on to a case study in the consumer products sector. So first, jumping into our overview and rationale, and this is sort of as we speak to companies that are interested in this process, how we advocate on behalf of conducting an impact assessment, and basing this all in the language from the UN Guiding Principles. So three main reasons why we advocate for doing a human rights impact assessment. The first is it helps companies make better decisions about product development, about operations, expansions, investments in certain markets, and really understand what the potential human rights impact assessments are in those decisions. The next is it allows companies to get complete coverage and visibility to potential positive and negative impacts where they're operating. So it helps companies see around corners to identify new risks or validate potential or hypothesized impacts. That allows them to allocate resources where necessary and really create the infrastructure necessary to mitigate risks where they're identified and confirmed. And finally, it helps companies make better decisions and be strategic about how they manage human rights impacts and prioritize which impacts to manage and mitigate first. As you're all aware, there's a pretty large universe of potential human rights impacts, and helping companies identify which ones to invest in to mitigate is a big win. So moving on to the next slide. So we've been conducting human rights impact assessments since the launch of the Guiding Principles in 2011, and this slide really touches upon a few key lessons that we've learned along the way. The first is around governance, and one of the most important things in a successful human rights impact assessment is creating ownership and having a home for the results. So it's not enough to work with a CSR human rights department that has the budget to invest in the process of doing it, but there must be ownership after the fact. And that's where this cross-collaborative approach to human rights impact assessments becomes very important. So the easiest way to go about this is having that team that invests in the human rights impact assessment on board, as well as those people that participate in it along the way. It becomes very difficult when there's a handoff where one team, the CSR team usually, invests in the impact assessment and then hands it off to a market to implement. that sort of lack of cohesion and lack of collaboration makes implementation and follow-up very difficult. The second is the importance of buy-in. So buy-in at the corporate level, you generally where the budget comes from, but also buy-in at the market level or the operational level where the impacts are identified. And part of the way to overcome this is, the process of going through a human rights impact assessment creates a type of training where market level or operation level employees become aware of how human rights might impact their processes and the rights holders within their universe. So creating buy-in through conducting the process itself becomes very important for the implementation process. And finally, we stress the importance of building on existing structures. So most of the companies that we work with have CSR or sustainability or human rights departments, and we really want to leverage those existing structures and governance models to the extent possible so that we're not creating new departments or steering committees and having to reinvent the wheel in a sense. Our human rights impact assessment process is very much based in the expectations outlined in the guiding principles, and we divide it up into 4 primary steps. The first is immersion, which is the first 2 speakers touch upon this pretty regularly, but this includes field level visits, document reviews, media research, NGO research, and is really a mix of desk-based and interviews on the field and with corporate level employees. So this is where we get to understand the company, understand what the NGO community and the media is saying about the company or the particular operations that we're looking into, and get a sense of what the risks are, both at the macro level and in the operations level. The second is to conduct the actual risk analysis, where we go through this scope of human rights principles, those 80+ international documents that exist, starting, of course, with the Universal Declaration and getting into the nitty-gritty on particular conventions that apply to the operations that we're looking at, and creating linkages between those international principles and the operations of the company, and really focusing in on what is most relevant to the assessment that we're conducting. And we go from there to categorizing impacts based on the relevancy to the company, and set the scope of the project that we're going to be analyzing. The third step is prioritization, and we use the UNGP language around salience and relevancy to do this prioritization, and this is where we come up with a process by which we really focus in on those areas of human rights where the company has the most impact and ability to remedy upon impact. And the fourth step in our process is to deliver a roadmap for mitigation and an action plan. And typically these action plans are multi-year action plans where we're starting with the areas of highest impact, as well as some easy wins, so that there's a mix of early successes as well as long-term mitigation processes. And so that's a brief overview of our process, and just want to be cognizant of time here, and I'm going to jump through these next couple slides real fast. But this is a snapshot of our tool. We have a proprietary tool that we use to conduct the prioritization process, and we go through these 4 steps that I reviewed earlier. Relevancy of the human right, the severity of that human rights impact, the ability of the company to remedy, and that gets us to the prioritization of each of the individual human rights impacts that we've identified along the way, and that in turn develops an action plan that we submit to the company, and it's an action plan and a multi-year strategy. Next slide. So now I wanted to jump into the case study. This is actually an ongoing project that we are doing for a multinational alcoholic beverage manufacturer. This is a manufacturer that is really a brand owner and has had a strategy of buying local brands over the last decade or so, and has corporate level strategies and policies around human rights, and is really looking to confirm whether those policies are being applied in the field and where adjustments need to be made. And we broke down our approach into a value stream approach. And the 5 value streams that we looked at in detail are listed here. Upstream raw materials, the raw materials that feed into the beverages. Upstream manufacturing, contractors, owned operations, and those are the operations that are owned directly by this multinational. And finally, downstream sales and marketing. So looking at the process of selling the alcoholic beverages and marketing and sales impacts on local communities, as well as those people that are in the sales and marketing operations. To begin with, we started with a corporate level process by which we made a lot of assumptions based on desk-based research and media reviews to understand what are the potential human rights impacts at the corporate level that we will anticipate going into the field. And this is a list of those impacts that were identified, broken up by both type of risk and risks and opportunities. In the risk side, these are a lot of the ones that I'm sure you're very familiar with. Basic labor rights risks in manufacturing, as well as environmental and social risks, and then social risks to the consumer in selling alcohol. On the opportunity side, we looked at potential for this company to create human rights opportunities through its expertise in managing agricultural supply chains and managing manufacturing processes. So upon identifying these corporate level human rights, we then tested these assumptions in the field. And we did this, as I said earlier, through a mix of interviews, field visits, each of which was about a week in duration, document reviews, and then process reviews and observation of those processes. Our assessments included interviews and operations with farmers and raw material producers, third-party manufacturers and suppliers, based on the market that we were in, directly owned operations, which included a mix of management interviews and worker interviews, as well as contractor interviews. Sales and marketing teams where we're actually in the field with marketing teams, observing how they interacted with bars and restaurants and other points of sale. And then finally, additional interviews with agents and contractors that were both directly employed by the operator itself, or the company itself, as well as employed by the agents and third-party operators. I'm going to just use 2 examples here since we're short on time. Some of the findings that we identified are listed here. In Mexico, we were investigating a tequila supply chain. One of the major concerns that we found was that about half of the agave that was purchased for production of this brand of tequila was purchased on the open market, and the other half was purchased from farms that were either rented or owned directly by the company itself. And that raised a number of concerns around visibility on labor conditions, but one of the primary concerns that it raised was who was the beneficiary of those purchases. In Mexico, there was, in this particular state, a lot of the farms were family-owned, and inheritance was passed along to siblings. Oftentimes, it was the male sibling that controlled the sale of the agave to the company itself. So female siblings were oftentimes denied the profits of those sales, and so there was concerns identified there around who the beneficiaries were in that situation. In Brazil, one of the major findings that we identified was agents of this company who were engaged in the marketing on the marketing side were subject to sexual harassment by bar and restaurant owners. So they had pretty high sales and marketing goals that were set by their agency and also set by the company, and did not feel that they could avoid certain bars and restaurants where sexual harassment was known to happen because they had these pretty lofty sales targets that they had to hit. So that was one of the major concerns that we identified. Some quick points on implementation. Again, really important to get corporate level buy-in as well as market level buy-in, and in this case, after each of the impact assessments that we did, the market was tasked with developing an action plan which the corporate level then approved, and monitoring of implementation was done on both ends. So we only have a minute left, so I wanted to open up to any questions in the time that we have left.
Thanks so much, Salah, and apologies everyone. We've had loads of questions in. Very quickly, Salah, how long did your assessment take? Was one of the questions.
Each market was a full week in the field, and typically we two BSR individuals went with one corporate level employee from the company, and we were able to divide and conquer. But a week in the field with 3 people looking at each of the different value streams.
Fantastic. And we've had some really interesting other questions in around engagement with local government, reasons why HRIs have not been made public. But I'm conscious that we have come to the top of the hour, and we will try and get back to some of those individuals whose questions we didn't get to in this webinar. Also, you should receive an email tomorrow, an automated email, which will have a recording of the presentation, recording of the webinar and the presentation slides. And just very grateful for your incisive questions. And our email addresses are listed on the earlier slide. I also wanted to draw your attention to the next 2 webinars in this series that are being sponsored by the Danish Institute of Human Rights. One on capacity building and stakeholder engagement, and one on integrating human rights into environmental social impact assessments. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Kendall. Thank you, Salah. And thank you all for your engagement.